Gosh, it's a delight to see a packed shrine room, and it's very meaningful to be here because I haven't been in a busy shrine room since pre-COVID times, which feels a long time. So many of you I have seen become mitras. I haven't met you in person, but I've okay, there we go. Please wave. Oh, that's probably better. And where it might not be as pleasant sometimes online listening with the microphone, so I'll try and be sensitive to the noise. Here's Donna Markova, a poem. I will not die an unlived life. I will not live in fear of falling or catching fire. I choose to inhabit my days, to allow my living to open me, to make me less afraid, more accessible, to loosen my heart until it becomes a wing, a torch, a promise. I choose to risk my significance, to live so that that which came to me as seed goes to the next as blossom, and that which came to me as blossom goes on as fruit. That's Donna Markova. So that opening line, I will not die an unlived life, that's quite a stirring statement to me, and I'm sure it is to several of you here in the room. It's a stirring call for action. And it's about honouring our lives. It's about honouring potential. And when I think I will not die an unlived life, I also think of the Buddha. And I'm thinking about the time when he was living with his family in quite a comfortable life, and he saw the four sights. So he saw for the first time, he really took on board, so it said, he saw sickness, he saw aging, and he saw death. And he had a connection with that, a living connection with the four sights, but he also saw a wandering monk. And I will not die an unlived life. There's something that inspired the Buddha to take that path of courage, of renunciation, of uncertainty and fortitude, and also sensitivity. So he led a life of deep sensitivity and tried to meet people really well, and the way he could do that was refining mindfulness, refining wisdom, refining compassion. And we're all trying to do that as well. So the Buddha has this long, well-lived life and legacy, honouring precious life and connection with what's most meaningful. And maybe that's why many of us are here today. We've come to the Buddhist Centre because we want a life of meaning, we want a life that is ethical, that leads to creative change, ethical, positive change, impacting the world in a positive way. And this is a path of creativity. It requires of us a real creative responsiveness to the moment, every single moment. And we're not there yet. But right at the heart of Buddhism and the Buddha's path was this irreversible creativity. So how can we stay alive to what inspires and lifts our heart? What makes us feel alive and feel deeply connected? Because feeling alive depends on feeling connected. A living connection with our practice, a living connection with what is most meaningful, a living connection with what inspires and guides. And the Dharma, the three jewels are very alive. The Dharma is not dry and dusty theory. It's a lived and living practice. the Sangha is not a noun, it's actually more like a verb. We Sangha. Sangha doesn't mean anything unless it's lived out in connection. And our connection with the Buddha is still alive today. His teachings are alive in us, and we can feel a direct connection with him. But this is honouring a living connection. And we do that with each other in various contexts. We do that in our study groups, on retreat, one-to-ones, through the path of friendship. And several people couldn't be here today who wanted to be. So two of my close friends, Tara Maitri and Mokshadeepa, both of whom may be listening or may listen later, but they have parents in hospital who were taken into hospital later. And this is a reality of our lives, isn't it? The Four Reminders tells us life has inevitable difficulties. No one can control it all. And we learn this. Life is our greatest teacher. Life will have difficulties, but how we can respond is a creative choice. And that is what the Buddha gave us, is creative choice. It's so important in the midst of our triumphs and tragedies and everything in between. So sometimes, like the Buddha, something might have happened to us, some significant event or moment of intensity, and sometimes it might feel like a fracture in our lives. There might be a before and an after. That can happen with illness. It can happen especially with the death of a loved one. And it might feel like a moment of fracture. It brings us up to the reality of impermanence. And I'd like to share with you a quote from Suleika Jawad, who lives in Brooklyn. She became ill at the age of 22. She was diagnosed with leukemia and needed a bone marrow transplant. And there she was, a graduate from Princeton University, wanting to become a war correspondent, feeling at 22 her whole life was in front of her, endless choices. And sadly, she received this life-changing diagnosis with a possibility of only something like a 30% chance of living through a bone marrow. Separate to that, she was of mixed heritage, and there was difficulty finding a match on the bone marrow register. And finally, her brother was her donor. So there she was in a hospital bed, and this is a quote from her. I learned early on that one of the great unfairnesses of cancer is how uncomfortable it can be for the people around you. There's a reason why, when someone is befallen with tragedy, our first response is often, I have no words. And sometimes when you don't have words, when you're worried about finding the exact right words, you end up saying nothing at all, and staying away because of it. That was something I found really heartbreaking early on after my diagnosis, that some of the people I expected to be there for me were not going to be able to be for different reasons. And there was this sense of feeling increasingly disconnected from the land of the living. And for about a year, I very much went into a kind of self-imposed retreat. I didn't know how to face my reality, which made it hard to explain it to the people around me who hadn't lived it. And really, that's what sent me on the path to writing, trying to find these words. So basically what she did was, in the 4 years of her treatment, she contacted the New York Times and sent an article in about her experience as a cancer patient and donor. And the New York Times said, oh, yeah, we can print your article. And because she was facing death, she said that helped her to become more brazen. And she asked the New York Times editor, actually, I'd really like to write a column and a blog. And that's what she did from a hospital bed. So she had a really creative response to what was a fracture that she described in her life, that enabled her to be more connected with people. And this column was very successful, and hundreds and hundreds of people wrote to her. That's what she found out when she first wrote in. So she was affecting other people who had experienced a fracture. And her blog was called Life Interrupted, because she felt her life had been interrupted. So she chose to do something very altruistic. And then after recovering, and when the leukemia went into remission, she travelled. She took on a 15,000-mile journey across the United States, and she met with various individuals who she'd made friends with, who'd responded to her blog. And some of those who'd also experienced life interrupted. One of those was a prisoner on death row. One of those was a mother who had lost her son when she was very young, when her son was young. She had this life, this living connection with these other people who'd gone through tragedy, and she just responded so well to that, and I found that really, really moving. And what she said was, she wrote a book which was a bestseller called Between Two Kingdoms, because what she said was she's had to learn to navigate between the life of the sick, the kingdom of the sick, and the kingdom of the well. And some of us might be experiencing that if we've experienced grief. It might feel there's a kingdom of the newly bereaved and people grieving in their own individual ways, in our own individual ways, and the kingdom of people who've gone through grief or who aren't experiencing it. And I've been very moved by how the link was made between those two kingdoms. She was quite, that healed the fracture. That healed the fracture. So just bear with me, I'm looking for my quotes. So there's a quote that I sent round to my chapter, because I meet every week with friends who've been ordained, and I've known them for many, many years. I first came along to the centre in 1997. That's when I met Moksha Jyoti. We have these friendships going way back, and over periods of time where we see our triumphs and tragedies. And there's a wonderful film called A Beautiful Day in the Neighbourhood that I'd highly recommend. It's really, really beautiful, and it profiles Fred Rogers, who was a bit like a national treasure, a bit like maybe David Attenborough for us, but he's like that to people who've grown up in the States. And he had a program, public service broadcast program, focused on children, and sometimes children who'd gone through tragedy. And what he said was, anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that's mentionable is more manageable, can become more manageable. And sometimes we have experiences that don't feel mentionable because they can feel overwhelming, they can feel too much to bear. This unbearable aspect sometimes of being human. And I really love that, because in our friendships, through our friendships, anything that's human is mentionable. Anything that's mentionable becomes more manageable. And that's what we find over time through our friendships in the Sangha, where we become more real with each other, we share what's really going on. It's such a blessing to be able to be yourself with good friends. And Sangha Rakshita set up the movement to enable that to happen. He's really encouraged us to meet in friendship. And we're bearing the fruits of that. So sometimes we have our own personal fractures, or seeming fractures. This is what the Dharma does. The Dharma heals these fractures, and I'll come back to that. And the role of metta and spiritual friendships in that is key. So I'm thinking in particular one person who was greatly loved and still is loved in our Sangha, even though she's not, her body's, her presence no longer with us in that form, but she's very much with us, and that's Sarah Sulana. And I remember this key event in 2015, early 2015, where she'd had news that she'd been invited to be ordained. And we had a bond because we both have and had rheumatoid arthritis, a connection. And I met her in the meeting room upstairs. I brought a cake from Marks and Spencer's, a reduced Christmas cake. And I wanted to celebrate the fact she'd been invited to be ordained. And there she was, that high of her life. And at the same time, she told me I'd just been diagnosed with interstitial lung disease because of a medication that we were both taking. And I didn't really understand the full import of what she was saying, but I knew it was significant. She was already having problems breathing. And there she was, looking forward to her ordination retreat in Spain, and also facing the reality, actually, of her mortality. When I looked on Wikipedia, I saw it had a limit. It was a life-limiting illness, and it would be progressive. And then I shared a room with her on retreat, and I saw other difficulties that she'd been facing to do with her feet and pain, a lot of pain. And she had this great humour, this spontaneity. She was so witty and alive and bright. And so when I think of her, the connection is still very much alive. And that's what I want to celebrate today. Just because people are no longer with us physically, we can still have a very alive and living connection with them. And we wouldn't be ourselves if they hadn't been in our lives. All of those people have helped us become who we are now. And so that is worth honouring, these living connections with people. So, looping back to Suleika Jawad, 10 years after first being diagnosed with leukemia, there she is, married to John Baptiste, who is a very talented musician. There's a film about their life called American Symphony. It's a beautiful, beautiful documentary that I watched with Padmadarshini on New Year's Day. It's very moving, very inspiring, very positive. And on the same day that he was notified he'd been nominated for 11 Grammys musical awards, on the same day Suleika was going back into hospital to begin chemotherapy again. And what they describe together in this film are the triumphs and tragedies of life and everything in between. And this is like a symphony of life. It's a symphony of life. We can't control what happens to us on some level, but we can control, or we can be aware of our creative responsiveness to whatever happens. And there they've made this documentary. It's on Netflix, so if you can find someone who's got a Netflix account, not borrow their password, but watch it with them. It's just a delight to watch with someone. And what they say is survival is a creative act. I've really felt that at different times in my life when I've had to dig deep. Sometimes I just haven't wanted to live at different times because life has felt too much to bear. And it's felt that survival really is a creative act. And thankfully, the Dharma and the three jewels have been in my life for 27 years now, and have helped me get through some really, really painful seemingly unbearable times in life that haven't been in my control. And I'm so grateful to the Buddha and to Sangharakshita and all my friends. And to the Sangha, just for creating a space where we can practice and move beyond self-created suffering. Because essentially that's what the Buddha showed us the way of, is freedom from self-created suffering. So we may have come across the first and second arrow teachings, which can be succinctly embodied in the phrase, pain is inevitable, suffering is a choice. So pain is inevitable, suffering is a choice. And the more deeply we practice, we see this. And apparently that is an aphorism that is also shared in Alcoholics Anonymous. So I'll come now to another quote. And this is a poet, Marie Howe. So Marie Howe had a younger brother, Johnny, and they had a very close bond. She said that when she was 16, they lived in a big house. Her parents both had 9 siblings, I think. She had about 100 cousins. It was a very busy and active house. And she was 11 years older than Johnny, so when she was 16 and needed to have some quiet space or work through some things, and he was about 5, she'd invite him out for a walk and they'd go around the streets holding hands together. And he was just a great comfort and bond, and they shared this bond until he died. So when he was 22, he was diagnosed with HIV, HIV positive. He was a member of AA and he became sober at 23. And then he died at 28 of AIDS-related complications in the 80s when a lot of young gay men were dying. And Marie had a very close relationship with him right up until his death. They spoke about 5 times a week. And he used to say to her, pain is inevitable, suffering is a choice. And he really meant it, and she saw that. And so even on his deathbed, when he had so many different symptoms going on, he said to her, this is not a tragedy, Marie, I am happy. Isn't that something to share? This is not a tragedy, Marie, I am happy. And the interviewer I heard this conversation with said, do you think he really meant that? And she said, yes, our relationship was so close that I knew him so well that he wouldn't try and pretend to me. Yes, he was happy. And this is a poem, this is a letter that she wrote to him. What she said is initially, she said, when Johnny died, it was a terrible loss to all of us. As you know, as everybody knows, you think, my life is changed so utterly, I don't know how to live it anymore. And then you find a way. This is her letter to him. It's called What the Living Do. Johnny, the kitchen sink has been clogged for days. Some utensil probably fell down there. And the Drano won't work but smells dangerous. And the crusty dishes have piled up, waiting for the plumber I still haven't called. This is the everyday we spoke of. It's winter again. The skies a deep, headstrong blue, and the sunlight pours through the open living room windows because the heat's on too high in here, and I can't turn it off. For weeks now, driving or dropping a bag of groceries in the street, the bag breaking, I've been thinking, this is what the living do. And yesterday, hurrying along those wobbly bricks in the Cambridge sidewalk, spilling my coffee down my wrist and sleeve. I thought it again, and again later when buying a hairbrush. This is it. Parking, slamming the car door shut in the cold. What you called that yearning, what you finally gave up. We weren't whoever to call or not call. A letter, a kiss. We want more and more, and then more of it. But there are moments, walking, when I catch a glimpse of myself in the window glass, say the window of the corner video store, and I'm gripped by a cherishing so deep for my own blowing hair, chapped face, and unbuttoned coat, that I'm speechless. I am living. I remember you. I find those words particularly moving when we think about loved ones who are no longer here and anyone who's ever affected our lives, whether they're living or dead. I am living. I remember you. Because most of our living is in the ordinary, everyday life, where we come up against our habits. Our habits continue, and time passes. And how long do we have? Literally, I'm looking, how long do I have as well? So are we aware we're living? Are we aware what keeps us alive of this precious opportunity? And do we bring a beginner's mind to what life is showing us? And are we honouring the lives of those who no longer have the choice? So, in one interview I saw with Suleika Jawad and John Baptiste, what she said is, after this second bone marrow transplant, she's been told that she'll be on chemotherapy for the rest of her life. And that was a really shocking fact to hear. And in that, her consultant said, I would encourage you to live every day as if it's your last. And what she said is, that didn't work for her because she found a kind of grasping and a doom-mongering and a desperation. And so what she said, she and John Baptiste, live every day as if it's your first. And I wonder what response you've had when I heard that. I loved that because that evokes to me the beginner's mind that ultimately that's all we have. Every day is our first in some ways. Nothing is fixed, everything is changing. What we are dragging along with us in our lives and carrying with us, nothing is fixed, everything is in flow. All of us are connected at this moment through the oxygen in the air. In COVID times, we didn't want to know that. That's one of the reasons why I haven't been in this room, in a busy shrine room, and I do have a mask that I might put on afterwards because I'm immunocompromised, and it makes a difference. But the Dharma really heals all fractures. We have the Upekkha Bhavana. It's an aspect of metta practice, and in the Upekkha Bhavana, we're encouraged to reflect on the sorrows of our life and other people's lives, and also the joys. And that's the reality. This is the triumphs and the tragedies. And what happens in the midst of that, with the joys and sorrows and everything in between, insight develops more clearly because we recognize that nothing is fixed and everything is in flow. Just like our thoughts, like clouds. When we chant the transference of merits, there's a line in there, my personality throughout my existences. What does that mean? It means that every moment of every day, my personality is not fixed. I'm rebecoming and rebecoming and rebecoming, and that's very liberating to connect with when I'm chanting the transference of merits. And I only realized that on my ordination retreat. There was something that twigged, and I thought, yes, my personality throughout my existence is. So Bhante has created Triratna and given us an opportunity to really connect with the Buddha's legacy that is alive to us today. And as the poem, we'll read Dawna Markova's poem again, but what we know in terms of ethical awareness and ethical hypervigilance or ethical vigilance, when the Buddha said, with mindfulness strive on, it's specifically mindfulness that has an ethical vigilance with it, because every single action of body, speech and mind counts. Every single action of body, speech and mind helps us rebecome a more skillful person, a more open-hearted person, or a tighter person, a more frightened person. And we're all working our own path. There's no right or wrong way to do this. We will come out with words that are not elegant, and there's no such thing as perfect. So when Sulaika Jawad was saying people didn't know how to respond, so they didn't say anything at all, I'd encourage us to just still move towards people suffering, hand on the shoulder. Maybe words aren't what we need at the time, but let's not beat ourselves up if we don't say something correct or just right, because there is no thing as correct or just right. We know that from the Dharma. And here's Bhante. I'll finish on this quote. The creative mind at its highest level is freedom itself. The creative mind, above all else, is the aware mind, the mind that is not asleep, the mind which is awake. And because it is aware, it is really and truly alive.